Lately, I've been trying to send you stories every day, but I feel like a large number of people who have signed up almost never come back to listen to the stories. I don't know where that is. Make you unhappy? I hope to receive comments and suggestions from you, and if you find the video good, please give me a like to give me more motivation. For those who have not yet subscribed, don't forget to click the subscribe button and press notification bell to wait for the next story. Now let's get into the story. Story 1. This happened a few years ago when I first got my driver's license. I was driving to the country for a friend's birthday. I had worked late, and I had left home for the 4-hour drive by myself at 7 at night, since all my friends had left before. But I really wanted to be there, so I didn't mind. The area I was driving through was quiet, sparsely populated farm area. It was known to have a few weirdos around, but nothing serious. Either way, I wasn't worried when I set off. I had been driving for ages, just listening to music and zoning out, and I had found myself on a road called Buckets Lane, an 80-kilometer stretch of road that is mostly straight, and was absolutely empty at this time of night. At some point, I took notice of headlights in my rearview mirror. It was the first car I'd seen in a long time, and although it seemed a long way behind me, it started to catch me fast. I was driving my 20-year-old Ford wagon, and was driving about 70 miles per hour, but this guy was coming up really quick. Soon after I saw the car, I started to hear the faint noises of intermittent honking that grew louder and louder as he got closer. He was honking from a huge distance away for no apparent reason. I was alone. I didn't even have phone reception. It gave me a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. I had a strong feeling that this person wanted to mess with me. After a while, this car finally pulled right up on me. I could see that it looked like a black pickup with 2 people inside, and before I knew it, he was tailgating me and still honking repeatedly. I freaked out. I was trying to wave him around me, but he wouldn't go. I didn't want to slow down, but I couldn't outrun him, so I was sort of stuck. At this point, he started flashing his high beams, which made it really hard to see, and then he started hitting my rear bumper, really smashing it. I was trying to keep myself together enough to keep my car on the road, but I was dealing with the bumping, the high beams, and the honking that was driving me insane. All this was happening around 70 miles per hour, and eventually something had to give. I swerved off the road, luckily into an open field, and slammed on my brakes. The car did a full 180-degree turn, and I slid backwards into a small ditch. I checked myself quickly, made sure that I was all in one piece. The car miraculously wasn't damaged, and I hadn't really crashed, so I was fine. I then looked up to look for the truck. It had kept driving, but it was slowing down, and then eventually turned around, drove slowly towards me, and started honking again. I panicked big time. I put the car in reverse for some reason, and slammed down on the accelerator. Big mistake. I just dug the car into the soft grass. The truck was driving into the field towards me. At this point, I realized that this person was potentially dangerous. Before, it could have been just someone playing a stupid prank. But now they had run me off the road, and were coming back, still honking the horn, obviously not coming to see if I was all right. They pulled up close to me, probably 20 meters away, and were shining their high beams on me, so I couldn't see a thing. I was still trying to reverse out of this ditch like a moron, and finally decided to put it back in drive. By this point, the honking had stopped, and someone had stepped out of the driver's side door. This person was short and fat, but all I could see was their silhouette, and this silhouette was now walking towards my trapped car. I took a few deep breaths. I was shaking and terrified, and slowly eased the pedal. The car was moving, but my wheels were spinning, and I didn't know if I would make it out. The person moved faster now, and got to my door. I locked it just in time when they pulled the handle, so he then started knocking on the window. He did not bash it. He just tapped on it, really calm and very slowly. I begged my car to move, and finally it did. I got some traction and got back onto the road, and just floored it. The honking started again, and pretty soon I saw the truck was racing to catch up with me. Finally, a car came in the opposite direction. I flagged them down by flashing my high beams, and this middle-aged woman got out of the car. I was hysterical, but once I stopped, I saw in the distance the lights of the black truck stopped, turned around, and zoomed off in the other direction. Thank God for this woman. She calmed me down and took me to the police station. I gave a statement and everything, but I didn't really see anything but a short fat silhouette and a black truck. So no help there. No one was ever caught, and the sounds of a honking horn will never sound the same again, and always sends a shiver down my spine. Story 2. This happened circa 1971 or 1972, when my mother was about 14 or 15 years old. The incident occurred in a heavily wooded area near Alabama, close to Birmingham. My mother is the oldest of 5 children. She has 3 sisters and a brother. One weekend in the cooler months of the fall, my grandfather decided to take my whole family, my grandmother, my mother, and all of my aunts and uncles, 7 people total, into the woods for target practice with a rifle. My mother grew up quite poor, and they didn't always live in the best neighborhood, so my grandfather wanted to teach the kids how to defend themselves with a rifle if they would ever need to. Like I said, it was later in the fall, so the trees were bare, and there were lots of leaves on the ground. The wooded area was just off of a dirt road, so this was a fairly rural area that they were in. Since it was so far off the beaten path, my grandfather became startled when he heard the roar of a car engine so deep in the woods. My mom remembers the car as being a blue Ford Galaxy. Despite the fact that my grandfather had a gun, he totally freaked out and told my grandma and the kids to hide in the woods. The man in the driver's seat of the blue Ford Galaxy dragged a woman's body out of the car and just dumped her there in the woods and drove away. After my grandfather was sure that the man had gone, everyone came out of hiding, and the woman sat up and stared them straight in the face. My grandfather asked the woman if she needed help. She said no, that she would be fine. She didn't seem to be injured and obviously didn't want help. She hadn't put up a fight with the man when he was dragging her out of the car, so she must have known him. So my grandfather cut the shooting lesson short and decided to rush his family home to safety. On the trail back to the dirt road where my grandfather had parked their car, they passed the man in the blue Ford Galaxy driving out of the woods. My mom looked over and noticed that he had a huge machete laying across the front seats right beside him. My grandfather made sure that the man could see that he had a rifle, but everyone was careful not to give away what they had just seen. The man struck up small talk with my grandfather, asking him how he was doing and what they were doing out in the woods. My grandfather explained that he had just taken his family out for some target practice with the rifle. The man told him to have a nice day and continued driving. The next day my grandfather went back out to the spot in the woods. There was not a body there. However, he did find the woman's wig, her purse, some Kleenex, and a pair of eyeglasses. He collected the items and took them home. According to my grandfather, that area of the woods was known for having shallow graves and being a dumping site for bodies. My mother became hysterical when he walked in the door carrying that stuff. She started screaming, "He killed that lady. He killed that lady." My grandfather ended up taking the items to the police station, but my mom doesn't think anything ever came of it. She never heard anything else about it after that. Well, she did hear one thing. Early the next morning, my grandmother called my mom when she arrived to work, just before my mother and her siblings left for school. My grandmother told my mother to not take the bus that day, that she would come home and pick them up and then drive them all to school. When my mom asked why, my grandmother said, "Because there's a blue Ford Galaxy parked at the bus stop." Story 3. I went on my hike today a little later than usual, starting up the mountain at about 6:30. I had gotten off work a bit later than usual, but that hadn't discouraged me from going on my hike. I love nature. I view my hikes as blessings, as opportunities to really take in the beauty that this world offers. I began the usual route, left at the giant rock and continuing straight for a while before making another left at the large oak. However, when I reached the oak, there was caution tape stretched from another tree to the oak, effectively blocking off the path so that you were forced to make a right. I had never taken a right at the oak tree, and I did not want to today either. I am not familiar with the path and I may get lost. That thought process is what led me to disregard the caution tape and proceed left anyway. It was then already rounding 7 o'clock. The sun was setting and I had experience hiking in the darkness and did not hesitate in continuing on my hike. Besides, I always bring my lighter and Swiss Army pocket knife whenever hiking, so I was not all that nervous. I started up the left of the oak and marveled at the gorgeous vegetation that I was surrounded by. The wildflowers, the trees with their blossoming branches, and the insects scuttling around. I was in heaven. As I continued on the trail, I approached an unfamiliar scene. This trail normally continues up and up the mountain to its highest point. One way up, one way down. However, as I looked ahead, I saw a fork in the trail. One way leading left, the other leading right. I had never before seen these two paths. Faced with a decision I was unfamiliar with, I could not decide whether to go right or left. I was not ready to end my hike, so I just decided to make it easy and go right. That was probably one of the biggest mistakes I have ever made. I should have turned back at the caution tape. After maybe a minute of walking on this stray trail, I saw something coming up on the path. As I neared the object, I noticed it was a compass. However, there was what appeared to be blood splattered on the glass casing along with many scratches. The needles were going back and forth as if running out of control. Instead of turning back, I picked up the compass and placed it in my sweatshirt pocket. I continued on the trail with nothing worth mentioning appearing for about 15 minutes. Then I saw it. Up ahead in the distance, I saw what appeared to be a golf cart with a large yellow bucket next to it. I came closer and realized how incorrect I actually was. I can now say that it was a poorly put together shelter, presumably housing a homeless person. When I passed the shelter, I got a good look on the inside. I saw a few scattered sheets of paper, a candle, what looked like some roots, and a few poorly made small brown dolls. I had no interest in exploring the small shack and continued on my hike. 20 minutes go by. I am nearing the top of the mountain. The sun had set, but it was still slightly bright enough outside to see. I reached the top of the mountain and relished the view. I can see the entire city with a 360-degree view of all of it. Nature is beautiful. I'm getting ready to make my way down and back to the bottom to my car. And then I see him. A man with a thick brownish-gray beard, slightly balding, and a little bit overweight. He is visibly shaking and mumbling to himself. I assume that this is the homeless guy which lives in the shack that I had come across. Not wanting any trouble, I attempt to pass him, making no eye contact and looking directly down towards the ground. But when we are directly next to each other, he reaches out and grabs me. Looking directly into my eyes, his eyes are crazy and bloodshot. His lips are quivering as he makes out a few words. Return what is not yours. He then reaches into my sweatshirt pocket and grabs the compass that I had picked up along my hike. I reach for my pocket knife, only to find that it is not there. I pull out my lighter and stupidly flash it at him like it's some sort of deadly weapon. He frowns at me, loosens his grip, and begins yelling nonsense at the sky. I sprint, not run, sprint as fast as I can while maintaining safety. I run past the 2 stray trails, past the caution tape and big oak tree, past the large rock, and finally reach the foot of the mountain. Reaching into my pocket, I grab for my car key and find that it is missing. In heavy panic, I start freaking out. I'm not going to go back to the mountains, but I don't have my keys. I decide just to go to my car and call AAA or something. When I reach the car door, I notice something. My car keys are inserted into the slot on the handle. On the ground, my pocket knife lays, undamaged and intact. What was written on the window scared the hell out of me. It was carved into the glass. I return what is not mine. Story 4. I was in Puerto Rico for vacation. About half a block from the house I was staying, I see someone on the other side of the street looking through a car. I didn't think much of it since he had the door open. I assumed it was his car, nothing suspicious, and kept walking. I was maybe a half block past him when I glanced back and noticed that he was standing next to the car, curbside, and he seemed to be staring at me. He was wearing a white shirt, so even though he was in the shadows, I could still see him. It seemed a bit creepy, but I figured that he probably lived there and just didn't recognize me and was seeing what I was up to. I kept walking and made my way down to the beach about another block and a half away. There was a small patch of some old grass just before some rocks, and then the beach. I stopped on the grass. I wasn't wearing shoes, and it felt nice on my feet. And stood under the palm trees for a moment sipping my beer, just kind of looking around, taking it all in. That's when I happened to glance back the way that I came again and notice a man in a white shirt standing near the end of the street. I stood there for a moment, trying not to let him know that I had seen him or that I was feeling uneasy at his presence in any way, and he just stood there as well. I was sure it must be the same man, as I hadn't seen anyone else on the street on my walk down. I continued to sip my beer, and he continued standing at the corner. He was standing completely out in the open, but it just seemed odd that he was just standing there. I didn't really want to look directly at him, so I couldn't really tell what he was doing. At this point, I was becoming fairly uneasy. I have never been worried about walking around at night, but I had never been in a place quite like this either. The road that ran along the beach had a few streetlights. The nearest one was just up the beach a bit, so I decided to make my way towards it in hopes that whatever this guy was up to, it had nothing to do with me. I walked back to the sidewalk as I figured it was better to stay where it was somewhat lit, and made my way over to the streetlight, all the while trying not to let on that I am aware of this man's presence and getting a bit freaked out. I got to the streetlight and stopped. I took out my cell phone to try and seem as casual as I could and glanced around and didn't see him anymore. I breathed a sigh of relief and figured that I had just been freaking myself out for no reason, and decided to call my girlfriend to tell her what had happened and that I was on my way back. I called her and started walking back towards our street, telling her about the guy creeping on me, and then I see him. At the end of the street, there was an abandoned house. It had no roof, doors, or windows, just walls, and I could clearly see that the man was standing in the doorway. I stopped in my tracks. "Oh, crap. He's still here," I said. He was far enough away that he couldn't hear me, but when I stopped, I saw him take a step back into the dark house. So I could no longer see him. At this point, my girlfriend was getting freaked out as well, so I turned around and started heading back towards the streetlight. There was another street up just a bit, and I figured I could take that and loop back around to the house. I tried to walk as normally as possible as to not let on that I was scared. When I got to the corner, I turned left and looked back, and I could see that the man was now coming down the sidewalk towards me. He didn't appear to be running, but he must have been walking quickly because he had definitely gained some ground on me. I turned to the corner, and once I was behind the house and out of sight, I told my girlfriend that I was hanging up and that I was going to run. I ran as fast as I could and did not look back. Of course, unbeknownst to me, one of the houses on this street had some rather large dogs, which, once aware of a person running by in the dark, began to bark wildly, scaring me even more. I made it back to the house, unlocked the gate, and quickly locked it behind me. I looked around to see if anyone had seen me, but there was no one in sight. My girlfriend was pretty freaked out, so we locked the doors and shut the blinds and called it a night. I didn't have any more run-ins with any late-night creepers the rest of the time we were there, and all in all, we ended up having a great vacation. It still gives me a little chill recounting this story, though. I have no idea what that man had planned if he had caught up to me, but something inside me says it would not have been pleasant. Story 5. I beg you, I implore you, please, do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I know those woods like the back of my hand. I was playing with my little brother among those trees when I was still in single-digit ages. So trust me when I say that something has been changing out there, and not for the better. I first noticed something was horribly wrong during a hike a few weeks back. In early spring, birds migrate back from the warmer, southern climates to their northern territories en masse. Thousands upon thousands of tiny songbirds occupy the trees around Mount Greylock during the month of March, each singing a sweet, chirpy song that is, in reality, a bellowed war cry, a call for challengers to step up and knock them off their perch. Yet as I trudged through the previous winter's leaf litter, I couldn't hear a single thing. No birds, or any other animals for that matter, seemed to still call the forest home. This made me nervous for two reasons. One, animals have an uncanny ability to detect dangers that are imperceptible to humans. Their sense of smell and hearing are far superior to our own. If the wildlife had fled the area in such a hurry, or at least refused to return, that could mean something awful was about to happen. And two, areas of woodland turned exceptionally quiet when there is a large predator around. Wood pigeons will become deathly quiet and still. hoping that a black bear or mountain lion will just pass them by. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. But either way, it would be hideously unsafe of me to wander around while one was prowling the area. So naturally, I started making my way back towards my car when something real peculiar happened. I feel I should remind you at this point that I had been playing in the woods around Mount Greylock since I was like 7 or 8 years old. It's pretty far from where our family lived when I was a kid, but thanks to our bikes, we had a pretty large area to roam when it came to those long summer breaks. Point being, I know those woods really well, but somehow, I managed to get lost. It first came to my attention that I had managed to get myself turned around when I felt my head begin to throb with a dull ache. I stopped walking for a moment, rubbing my eyes and the bridge of my nose to try and massage away the ache. But when I opened my eyes again and looked around, I felt a faint flash of panic running through me. I did not recognize my surroundings, and I cannot understate how jarring that was for me. To be somewhere I had been visiting all my life, only for it to feel utterly foreign to me. I actually had to take a moment to take out my compass just to try and get a bearing of where I was headed. But to my surprise, the compass needle kept slowly moving around. Even when I had got it to sit still on a supposed bearing, it slowly began creeping around again. Now, this was much less of a problem than it might appear. Sure, it was unnerving, but there are ways around a faulty compass. Like, for one, moss mostly grows on the north side of a tree, the side that gets the most sunlight. So that provided an easy way of determining which way was north. At least, it usually would. Because as I inspected various tree trunks, I realized the sun was hanging in the southern portion of the sky. That, or the moss in the area, grew mostly on the south section of the tree trunks. I get that it's not entirely out of the question, but that was yet another detail that just seemed to fry my brain. Nothing made sense, and the less that it did, the more the feeling of pure panic began to bubble up in my chest. But to panic in that situation, in any kind of situation, is to welcome defeat, degradation, and death. I kept myself calm, told myself that there was a rational explanation for everything that was occurring, and walked off in the direction I was almost sure the nearest highway was. It was then that I came across something I had never, ever seen in those woods before. Something that seemed so out of place, that it was frankly terrifying. In all the years I had spent roaming those woods with my brother as a kid, I had never seen anything like the old, run-down cabin that stood before me, and I mean it was old, as in there was no way it could have been built any later than the 70s. So just how me and my brother had missed this place was utterly beyond me. The obvious thing to do was to knock on the cabin door, see if anyone was home, and as much as I might find it humiliating, ask for directions. But as I walked closer and closer towards the rustic front door, I felt the most unusual sensation. I put it down to general tiredness. Maybe my blood sugar was low. I'm not entirely sure, but for whatever reason, each footstep that took me closer to the cabin seemed more and more difficult. By the time I was actually bringing a closed fist up to knock on that old wooden door, it felt like something was physically repelling me from it, whispering directly into my brain, "Leave this place and never return. Do not look back. Never look back." When I finally knocked, the door creaked open slightly, revealing the dilapidation behind it. Whatever bolts or locks that were on the door had long since been worn away, and the inside of the cabin was just as run down and rotten as the outside. It was evidently abandoned, but there was a curious order to the furniture that led me to believe that every so often, The cabin did actually receive some visitors, aside from me. But something in the corner of the cabin drew my attention. What I'm about to attempt to describe is, quite frankly, indescribable. I know it was a wooden idol of some kind. A small statuette sat atop of a stone altar. But, and I appreciate that this is intensely confusing to visualize, I could not make sense of what I was looking at. It was like my brain was completely incapable of computing the information my eyes were feeding it. And with that, my headache returned again, along with a kind of anxiety so crushing that I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. Don't ask me how I know, but that wooden idol, a mess of twigs and vines and moss, was a representation of pure, unfiltered evil, and I ran from it. I'm not in the least bit ashamed to admit that I ran like a scared child from that cabin. I ran until I found the highway, ran until I found my car, and drove like a madman until I was safely back at home. I haven't been able to bring myself to talk about what happened to me that day until now. I tried to tell a hunting buddy of mine once, but the words just wouldn't seem to come out. But please, if you're listening to this, heed my warning and do not go hiking in the woods near Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Story 6. Back in May of 2012, when I was in my senior year of high school, my school joined up with another school for a trip to the UK. It was honestly the adventure of a lifetime, but there was one night in Scotland that I cannot explain and I will certainly never forget. We had worked our way through England and into Scotland and were venturing north into the Scottish Highlands, where we would be spending a few days before returning south to Glasgow to catch our flight back to Canada. It was really nice to be up there, as up until this point on the trip, we had been mostly exploring bustling cities and doing all the usual tourist activities of the UK, so it was nice to spend a few days just relaxing and taking in the natural beauty of northern Scotland. The place that our tour guide had picked out for us to stay was perfect. It was a resort in this beautiful valley which housed one of the many lakes in the area. Being the off-season, we pretty much had the place to ourselves, and when we weren't out exploring the surrounding countryside, we would be playing soccer in the large field a little ways from the main hotel building, or sitting around the fire pit talking about stupid teenager stuff. There was a girl from the other school that I had my eye on ever since the trip began. Her name was Brooklyn. She was a tall brunette with gorgeous eyes. Pretty much the most beautiful girl 17-year-old me had ever seen. I really hadn't been able to get close to her yet, as when we split off into groups for the day trips, her and I never seemed to end up in the same one. Now that we were on a less structured schedule, I figured this was my chance to get to know her. At first, I tried the direct approach by sitting down next to her around the fire the first night and introducing myself. She said hi, but quickly just blew me off. Went back to talking with her friends. Somewhat defeated, I got up to go grab something from my room and rethink my strategy. I don't consider myself to be a terrible-looking guy, but compared to Brooklyn, I may as well have been Gollum from Lord of the Rings, so I knew I'd have to try extra hard to impress her. I was suddenly snapped out of my trance with her, as I heard a shrieking sound out the window of my room. It sounded like a woman screaming, and it initially gave me goosebumps until I realized what it was. It sounded like the whistle of an old steam locomotive. I figured there must be a heritage railway around here somewhere, since the UK is full of them, but it was odd, as I wouldn't have thought they would run trains this late. I did remember seeing what I thought was a railway track on the other side of the field, near the resort, so it wasn't too out of the ordinary. I quickly forgot about it and made my way back to the fire, and by this point, A lot of the other students had paired off into impromptu couples of the night. Fortunately for me, Brooklyn was sitting by herself on a bench on the opposite side of the fire from most of the other kids. I sat back down next to her and tried to pluck up some courage to talk to her again after my previous failed attempt. She jumped a little as I said hi, as if she hadn't even noticed me sit down. I apologized for startling her and asked if she was okay. She didn't reply, but I could tell by the way she was looking at the guy across from her, cuddled up with another girl, that she wished it was her over there. We talked for a little bit, and then I asked her if she wanted to take a walk. I had remembered the railroad track I had seen earlier and figured it would be pretty romantic to get her out of there and watch the midnight freight trains roll by. She somewhat begrudgingly agreed. I don't think she really wanted to go, but I guess she wanted an excuse to not think about her crush and another girl together. It was awkward at first trying to keep the conversation going as we walked, but she started warming up to me gradually as the night went on. We found a spot to sit by the railroad tracks, and soon there was a distinctive rumble of an approaching train, followed by the iconic two-tone air horn sound of British diesel locomotives. We sat there and watched the train slowly roll by, and just as the last car disappeared around the corner, the clouds in the sky completely cleared, revealing the brightest full moon I had ever seen. We sat for another hour and no more trains passed by. Brooklyn then mentioned that she was cold, and I have to admit, the temperature had seemed to drop significantly after the clouds had cleared. So we began to get up when she grabbed me and said, "What was that?" I listened, and far off in the distance, I heard the same shrieking noise I had heard earlier. I was about to brush it off and tell her it was just another train, when it struck me that it was almost 1 a.m. at this point. The first time I had heard it, it was only 9:30. But there was no way that a heritage railway was running a steam train this late into the night. I told her it was probably a coyote or something, even though I have no idea if they have those in this part of Scotland or not. And we began walking back along the tracks toward the road that led back to our resort. It was getting colder by the second, it seemed, which was really weird, as the weather had been so warm just an hour ago. And there was the cloud in the sky to signal an impending storm. As we neared the embankment we had climbed down from the road earlier, I noticed that I could see my own breath in the night air. I turned to look at Brooklyn, and she had noticed the same thing I had. "We had better get inside," I said. "There's got to be some bad weather coming." Truthfully, I had no idea what was going on, but it was the only reasonable thing I could think to say. Then, the shrieking came again, and it was a lot closer this time. Brooklyn and I jumped and cowered together Scooby-Doo style for a second, which made us both chuckle a little bit at how on edge we were. Then we heard what sounded like rapid deep breathing approaching us from behind. I turned around and saw a white cloud of steam maybe 500 feet down the tracks behind us. Emerging out of it was a blue steam locomotive pulling some extremely outdated-looking freight cars. "I thought they didn't use steam trains anymore," Brooklyn said to me nervously. "They don't," I quietly replied while keeping my eyes fixed on the train. Even though there was a fence between us and the tracks, I felt like we needed to get farther away. But my morbid curiosity got the better of me, and I walked a little bit closer to the tracks. I figured it's a train. It's not like it can come off the tracks and hurt me, right? Brooklyn stayed farther back as I approached the fence. The train was approaching fast, and the sound was getting louder. It was a beautifully decorated blue locomotive with the letters CR painted on the tender on each side of what appeared to be some kind of coat of arms. It let out a deafening shriek, and the engineer waved his hat to us as the train passed by. We were also blasted with the coldest wind that we had ever felt, which made me finally retreat away from the train tracks. We began to run since we were now freezing, and by the time Brooklyn and I made it back up the hill to the road, there was no sign of the train anymore, and the clouds were beginning to return as well as the warmth. When we got back to the resort, our tour guide was outside having a smoke. He asked us how our walk had been, and we decided not to mention the mysterious train, but we did mention that it had gotten cold when the clouds had cleared up. He looked at us funny, and said that it had been warm and overcast all night, as far as he had noticed. Brooklyn and I said goodnight and went to our rooms. I stayed up a little while longer on my laptop, trying to see if there were any local legends of trains in the area. There were none, which didn't surprise me. It didn't really strike me as a ghost train though, as the only peculiar thing about it was that it was so outdated, and the sudden cold snap as it passed by. From my research, I did uncover that CR stood for Caledonian Railway, and that the engine I had seen was an 812 class, which were built in the late 1800s, and were used in the region up until the 1960s. These locomotives were actually the basis for the characters of Donald and Douglas from the Thomas the Tank Engine TV show, and one of them, number 828, actually has survived into preservation and been restored to working condition. I don't think the restored engine is what I saw that night though. I doubt it would have been running that late at night, and also number 828 was supposedly in England at that time, according to Wikipedia. Plus, even if it was number 828, that still doesn't explain the cold snap it seemed to bring with it. I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but I believe that what we saw that night was not from this world. I know that sounds insane, and trust me, it is, but I can't think of any other explanation. It wasn't transparent, or spooky looking, or anything like what you would expect a ghost to look like. It looked exactly like how I would imagine it had looked when it was still in service. So real and normal looking, yet also very unsettling by its mere presence outside of its time period. I don't believe that the train or its crew had any malicious intent, as the engineer seemed rather friendly as he waved to us. I believe it might be the spirits of the old railway men who used to ride on these rails back when the steam power still ruled the world. Brooklyn just pretended the whole night never happened. I don't think it was out of fear of the possible ghost encounter, but rather to stop rumors of us hooking up from spreading. Her and I did talk about it the next morning in private, and she did admit to me that she had heard the whistle shrieking again while she was lying in bed. I was unsuccessful in getting her number though, so after we got back to Canada, I never saw her again, even though we only lived 30 minutes apart. So if you're ever in Scotland near a railway line at night, and the clouds suddenly part, and the temperature starts to fall, be on the lookout for a blue Caledonian steam locomotive and its crew as they ride on into the night, delivering their cargo to a destination likely beyond our world. Story 7. So I've always been open to paranormal things. I recall several things as a child, but the older I get, the less I see. Adulthood and responsibilities have taken over my ability to see things that I once did. I had a son in January of 2011. By 2013, when he was almost 2 years old, we moved out of my mother's house into our own apartment. It was kind of a rushed ordeal, as my mom and I butt heads a lot, and as soon as I had the money, I went to the first available opening. The apartment manager had actually asked me to hold on for an extra 2 weeks, because as she said, some girls were moving to Florida and left the place a mess, and it needed cleaning up. She never asked for a credit check, any references, or anything. It was just an okay. I'll let you know as soon as the rental is up to par. I moved in probably a month after she said I could have the unit. Upon moving in, I had a strange but comfortable feeling. I started out with nothing but a box of toys and a nice blow-up mattress for myself and my almost 2-year-old son to share. It was a 2-bedroom apartment, 1 bathroom, lots of closet space. Eventually we made it home, but one day my son was in the spare bedroom and started laughing. A hearty baby laugh that takes work to muster from any baby really. I walk in and he is staring at the corner and acts as though he didn't even see me there. Then suddenly he stops. Anyone with a child knows that this is a little bit odd. The child will normally look to the source of entertainment for more, but my son just stopped and toddled towards me as if it was told to do so. It seemed odd, but I dismissed it. Fast forward a few months. We've got our own beds, although I let him sleep in mine, and I awake one night to him belly laughing once again, full-on giggles in the darkness. Nothing but the moonlight through the sheer curtains bouncing from my face onto his since I'm the one facing the window, and he's looking over my shoulders into the darkness. A big smile is spread over his face, and I say, "What's so funny?" And he says, "The man," as he still glitters over my shoulder. But then his smile gets scared and serious, and he puts his tiny fingers over his lips, as though he's mimicking somebody trying to say SHH. Needless to say, I did not go night-night that night. Days, weeks passed, and small incidents happened where he would be laughing or talking about his friend. I started not worrying about it because to me it wasn't that big of a deal. He stopped being creepy at night. One day though, he was in what was supposed to be his room, just cracking up and laughing once again. When he came into the living room I asked him, "What's so funny in there, bud?" And he replied, "The man, he's funny. He tells me jokes. He's not a monster. He's nice, mama. I just figured he has an imaginary friend. Wonderful, whatever." This goes on another week or two, until one day he is in his room having a full conversation. I don't recall what about. I just remember hearing him chatting in there as if he was having an actual conversation, and him repeating the word I knew he didn't know, too big for an almost 2-year-old's vocabulary. He comes into the living room and I ask again, "Who are you talking to in there?" He says, "The man, mama." I knew I shouldn't ask, but I did, and I said, "What's the man look like?" And he replies, "Bumpy. He's bumpy, mom. Looks like a monster, but not a monster, mom. He's nice. He tells me jokes. He's nice." I'm sitting there, like, okay, cool. This is totally an imaginary friend. All is fine. And that was that. A few days later I woke up suddenly to a fight in the hallway. My next door neighbor had come home drunk and was banging her apartment door like a complete psycho. I had grown up rather comfortable in a town where literally locking your doors was optional. So for once I went to the door to lock it so this woman wouldn't accidentally open my door, and it was already locked. The door handle, the deadbolt and the chain lock. I had never locked the deadbolt, let alone the chain lock. I was confused, but wrote it off as me being a tired mom. The next morning bright and early my son wakes me up. "Mama, the man saves us. He locked the door from the bad lady, mama." Again I write it off as he heard the commotion that I had before and created it in his imagination for my reactions. Later that day I had just gotten a carload of groceries and I took the first few bags in and up the stairs, and I got a movie in for my son to occupy him while I got the rest inside. I go out on maybe the 3rd or 4th trip and the neighbor catches me. She's my age. I haven't met her before, but she seems kind. She approaches me and introduces herself and asks, Maybe this isn't appropriate, but how much do you pay for that apartment? I didn't exactly know what rules to how units were priced, so I just vaguely asked why, and she said, well, didn't they tell you what happened here? No. She said she was waiting on some girls to move out who were going to go to Florida, but I trailed off. She says no, there was a dad and a son who lived in there. They both had that genetic disease where you get bumps all over your skin. The son killed himself in the spare bedroom by overdosing, and nobody knew for days. They had all sorts of cleaning crews in there. It's a shame too, because he would always tell my kids jokes and say, see, I tell jokes, I'm not a monster. He was so sweet to my boys. He was so worried about scaring them. He'd always tell them jokes. Story 8. This is a story about Oscar. Just know that this is a sick and twisted man that I had met online when I was 18 and ended up dating. He was jealous, controlling, vindictive, abusive in every possible way, and was filled with sadistic tendencies and rage. So I had tried to leave Oscar many times. I wasn't happy. In fact, I was in a constant state of panic, and it was absolutely miserable in the relationship that had lasted just a year. Each attempt to leave him was met with threats to hurt me and my family, physically dragging me back, sexually assaulting and purposely trying to impregnate me, threatening to commit suicide, or constantly stalking and harassing until I surrendered. Finally, I had enough and decided I wasn't going back no matter what he did. He called my job non-stop and got me in major trouble, and did the same thing at my house, prompting me to unplug the phone line. He texted me to say he promised he was going to kill himself if I didn't go back to him. Instead of caving in, I called his mom at work and told her. She got a hold of him and said I must have misunderstood because he was clearly fine. I felt I'd done all I could do. I told him I'd call the police next time he said something like that, to have them go check on him. The next day I got a call on my cell from Oscar. I rejected it. He called again and I rejected it again. Then I heard the loud exhaust on his car outside. When I looked down at my phone and saw him calling again, I let it go to voicemail while I peeked through the blinds to check if I had truly heard his car, as I'd started to falsely hear it sometimes out of paranoia. But this time he was indeed out front of my house. My phone started ringing again, and wanting him to stop, I answered it. He told me to come outside. I don't want to see you, I said. Just come outside for a few minutes, please. Oscar said, making a huge effort to sound pleasant. I told you to stop calling me, and you show up at my house. Why can't you respect my wishes? I asked, knowing that the question wouldn't be answered. I just felt bad about how everything went down. I wanted to give you something I made for you before you broke up with me. Just come outside for a few minutes so I can apologize, and then I'll go away and you'll never hear from me again. I don't know. I don't trust you. I promise I drove all the way here to give you what I made you, and just to have a proper goodbye. In hindsight, I should have called BS on all of that immediately, but I was so young and still so controlled by my need to not hurt other people's feelings. I felt bad that he had driven the 40 minutes to my house was something he'd made for me. For me just to refuse to come out. Fine, and you promise you're not going to try to beg me back? He promised, and I went outside. I opened the side door and sat down in the seat, leaving the door wide open. He commented that I must think he's going to kidnap me, trying to pass it off like a joke. I told him I just wanted the leg room. He had a bouquet of flowers and some cases of DVD he'd burned for me. All of the seasons of my favorite TV show. We talked for a minute when my cell phone rang. I shouldn't have picked it up knowing it was a guy from my job, but I was an idiot. I answered it and talked to the guy for less than 30 seconds. Oscar could hear it was a man's voice. I could instantly tell when I saw his head snap to attention and my peripheral vision When I hung up, Oscar looked at me with fury in his eyes and asked some questions about the color that I can't even recall now. Before I could reply to what he asked, he had slammed on the accelerator and was flying down the street with my door still open. I instinctively pulled my legs into the vehicle and started screaming for him to stop. He didn't seem to even be hearing me. I tried to jump out when he slowed down at intersections, and seeing this, he grabbed my clothes with his hand to hold me in and started making sharp left turns through the neighborhoods to force my door to swing shut. Once that was accomplished, I tried to open the door again, and he kept hitting the automated locks to stop me, and was constantly increasing his speed to ensure any leap from the car would be dangerous. By now it was dark outside. He was speeding through my town, double the speed limit. I was hoping a police officer would see this and start tailing him and pull him over. But apparently he had gone unseen. He reached the freeway, and I started really panicking. He would be able to go even faster here and fast-track me wherever exclamation he planned to take me. It took maybe 3 minutes to get to the freeway at the speed he was going, all of which I spent trying to get out of the vehicle. Once he was on the freeway, he was going over 100 miles per hour. I kept looking at the speedometer. It was dark outside, and that was much too fast to jump from a moving car on the freeway with other cars driving at high speeds and unable to see me. I still had my phone, so I tried to dial 911. I pressed the numbers with my hand shoved on the side of the seat by my window, away from Oscar. But he saw what I was doing and started swerving all over the road while trying to grab my phone. I still don't really know how he managed to get it away from me, because every ounce of my being was trying to hold on. He took it. He rolled down his window, and he threw it out. Rolling his window back up, he flatly stated, "If I can't have you, then no one will." That sentence made my heart sink. I felt like I was in a Lifetime movie. Oscar was possessed by his need to possess me, and I was trapped. This is when the grim reality started to set in. He was out of control, and I was out of options. I started screaming for help and pounding on the windows. But Oscar had the tint on those windows so dark that I probably wouldn't have even seen if it wasn't so dark outside. I watched as the people in each car we passed remained blissfully unaware of the chaos going on in the car that I was kidnapped in. I was feeling very defeated, but was running through all the possibilities of how this could go over and over in my mind, trying to figure out how to survive. I decided to stop fighting and acting afraid, because the only way I saw myself making it out of this alive was by feeding into Oscar's delusional state. I had no other weapons or means of escape at my disposal, so I decided on psychological warfare. Oscar had this friend named Jose that he had gotten exceedingly close to over the course of our relationship. After a time, it was revealed to me in confidence that Jose had fled from Puerto Rico, supposedly on the run for murder. I saw Oscar was taking the necessary freeway interchanges to get to Jose's place, and knew that even if his friend hadn't really been wanted for murder, he was the type of guy who would do anything for Oscar without moral restriction. Jose and I got along okay, but I knew he'd have no loyalty to me whatsoever. He was nice to me as long as I was an extension of Oscar. I had to act quickly. I proceeded to tell Oscar that I loved him and wished that we could be together, but that I don't see how it could ever work with things like what he was doing right now proved that he never cared about what I wanted. I hadn't necessarily cited that as a reason for wanting out of the relationship before, as it was much more complex than that, but I was hoping it was enough to offer him hope in this state of desperation. I told him that I had been considering giving him another chance when I saw the flowers and DVD, but now that he was refusing to take me home when I asked him to, I was starting to second-guess things. Oscar got off of the freeway on Jose's exit, and I started trying to formulate a plan when the car stopped. I knew Jose had neighbors close by, and I decided I was going to run as fast as I could and scream at the top of my lungs. I was trying to keep Oscar's mind preoccupied in the meantime, though, so that he wouldn't think to call Jose and give him the heads up. They usually spoke to each other in Spanish, so I would have no idea what was even said. Oscar told me that he did care about what I wanted and asked if he still had a chance with me if he turned around. Right now, in an effort to not expose myself with an overly enthusiastic reply, I hesitated a bit and said I thought we could probably work it out and this would be a good place to start. Oscar leaped around and got back on the freeway, heading in the opposite direction back towards my house. The rest of the ride was tense because Oscar was normally so perceptive, and I didn't want to reveal myself and end up back in the line of fire. I can't recall what was said on the commute back, but I'm opted to talk about regular, everyday things I normally would say to him in casual conversation. When we got back to my house and he let me open my door and didn't stop me from leaving, I could finally breathe. I got out, taking the flowers and DVD with me, and waved to him before walking into my house. I walked straight to the garbage bin and threw it all in the trash, and then collapsed on my couch, shaking violently but ultimately so grateful to have made it home. The next day I went to the police and filed a restraining order against him. Within a few years he would be jailed for all appalling crimes and sentenced to 60 years. Until I found that out, I never truly felt safe, but now he's definitely where he belongs. Story 9. Just for context, my boyfriend and I are homeless and we live in our car. There was a road that leads to a quiet beach on the bay near some train tracks, and there was only one road to exit. So not a lot of people come down this way unless it's for beach access. People going to work in the industrial plants on the road, none of which were open. Going to an AA meeting, again none of which were open at the time, or if they were sleeping in their cars as well. Nothing in the area was open except maybe a couple of bars, and even those were a good 3 to 4 blocks away. Most of the stretch of road has 8-hour parking signs, so there are usually at least a few other people camped out for the night, most of whom we had seen before, but tonight there weren't as many, just a few vehicles taking advantage of the overnight parking. We parked a little further up the road than we normally do, hoping to get a better internet connection. It was a little after 12:30 a.m. and we were relaxing watching YouTube with the dog starting to get sleepy when we heard a car pull up behind us with their lights off. We cover our windows totally around so no one can see in, but we can peek out if we move a blanket, and we can see headlights from cars passing or approaching. My boyfriend said it was a van. We didn't think much of it and kept trying to watch our show, annoyed with the spotty Wi-Fi connection. There was a few words exchanged on what sounded like was on the other side of the street, not behind us where the van pulled up. It sounded like there were 3 or 4 people. A little bit later the van drove off, then we heard a knock on my side window, driver's side. We shut off the volume on the laptop and called out, "Yeah," but silence, so we called out again, "Can we help you?" But again there was nothing. It was then that I realized that my door was unlocked, so I quickly locked it. After about 30 seconds of quiet, I pulled open the cover and no one was there. There were sometimes bums walking around. They could have thought we were someone else. It was silent for a while, then we could see in the light of the street lamp through the crack on the sun reflector covering the front windshield the silhouette of somebody walking around the front of the car slowly. It was another solid minute after we saw the movement before we heard a quieter tapping on the passenger side window. This time my boyfriend pulled the cover down right away, and again we didn't see who it was. Right after this there was a knock on my side again. It was right around then we realized that there was still more than one person around the car. There was no time for one person to get from the passenger side to my side between the second and third knock. We had heard more than one voice prior. I started to think that maybe not everyone had gotten back inside the van before it drove off. So after the third knock, I pulled my window cover down again almost all the way. Super annoyed and on edge by now. There was a skinny white male, probably in his 30s to early 40s, holding a flashlight and something else scooped awkwardly in the other hand. Almost like he was keeping it under his sweater, but we couldn't make it out. The windows were steamed up from us breathing inside with the windows shut tight, so it was really difficult to see out. He said, "Hey, I need a jump." Interesting, since there are no stores nearby. No reason to be down here at 1 a.m. We said, "Sorry, we're just about to take off, we're in a rush." He got frustrated and whined, "Come on, I've been down here for hours." Okay, if he had been down here for hours, why did he not ask us to help him out about 45 minutes prior when we pulled up, parked, let our dog out to meet, go to the bathroom, etc., and get our bed set up, or attempt to start the car at any point? We never heard a motor rev up and attempt to turn on the engine or even the jingling of keys. Another thing that creeped me out was that I could only see him. He said, "I need a jump. I have been down here for hours," when I could clearly hear that there were more than one person around, but we couldn't see them. For one reason or another, they were standing out of view of not making themselves known. After this, he grumbled and went across the street to a white car with black rims that we had seen before but not associated with him. I got this awful feeling in my gut, and even though all the windows were steamed up, I started the car and told my boyfriend to start wiping the window so I could see, and I just started driving. We could feel like there was something sinister about the whole situation. For one reason or another, they were trying to get us to open a door or window. When that didn't work, they didn't respond because they didn't have a good reason made up yet. So after a couple of attempts to get us to open the door, they gave us the sob story, hoping we would get out of the car so they could either steal the car while we were trying to help them get to my boyfriend, or they were trying to rob us for the laptop, which I'm sure they could hear and see the glow of the screen. The possibilities are unsettling and endless. Or maybe he was just a guy who happened to need a jump at 1 a.m. nowhere near any stores or houses, and I'm the hole that left some poor guy down there on the side of the road. We all drove to McDonald's to eat something and parked in the back driveway of someone we knew so that we weren't out in the open anymore. The lock on our trunk recently broke and is held together only with bungee cords with most of our belongings inside, so it worries me that it could make us an easier target for thieves. The next morning we were down there again, and the white car with the black rims was still there. Only now the back window was busted out and the man was nowhere in sight. I think it never was his car to begin with. I think all those people came in the van and one of them drove off so that the rest of them could rob someone outright, or so they could break into the parked cars on the side of the street when no one was in them. It was really stressful, and my boyfriend has been rattled for days. We are nervous to park in the same spot, so we are now looking to rent a residential driveway to park at night so we won't be so vulnerable. My boyfriend teased the dog for not barking, but I think it was very intuitive of him, because if we needed to pretend we weren't inside the car, we would have been able to do so. Maybe it would have scared them right off. I like knowing that he will wait and watch me to know what to do in stressful situations. I am just so relieved that I was not down there by myself. Even the two of us together were pretty nervous, knowing that we were likely outnumbered, but if it were just a 120-pound female like myself in the car alone, I am worried they may have been a bit more aggressive about getting in the car door open. Sometimes I think I watch too many murder investigation shows and conspiracy theory videos, and that it might make me paranoid. Maybe it's the fact that my grandfather was a sex crimes and homicide detective for 30 years in the same area, and I grew up with him constantly warning me of the dangers that lurk in the dark and what can happen to a person. He taught me that real monsters are not boogeymen. It can be anybody. Story 10. This happened a few years ago back when I was in college. I attended a school that was in a very bad area. An area filled with prostitution, drugs, and gang violence. Despite all this, the school is actually a pretty good school and is usually relatively safe as long as you're not out too late and stay on campus. Well, my mistake was I was not home before nightfall. At that time I worked on campus, and after my shift I started doing some homework. I lost track of time, and before I knew it, the cleaning crew had arrived, and I was told that I had to leave. I checked the clock and it's 10:30 p.m. I normally walked home from work as I only lived maybe 1 block off campus. However, tonight I decided to call the safety escort service to be safe. So I call and they quote me 10 minutes. I wait 10 minutes and then go outside, effectively locking myself outside of the building. I thought this would be okay because the safety escort was supposed to be here any minute, except they were running late. After about 5 minutes of waiting, I debate just walking home. No one is out except this one man across the street where I exited the building. So I figured it was a relatively safe time to walk back. He's coming from the direction I would need to walk in though. So I decide to be safe and wait for him to pass. Thank God I did. As soon as this man reaches the parking lot I'm in, instead of heading past me, he does a sharp turn and starts walking towards me. He starts shouting aggressively at me, something along the lines of, "How much do you charge?" As I mentioned before, this is an area known for prostitution, so I figured he mistook me for a prostitute. So I shouted back, "I'm not a prostitute. I'm a student." He keeps coming closer, still muttering angrily under his breath. At this point I'm scared, but I'm still wondering if this is some sort of misunderstanding. So I shout, "Do not come any closer. You are scaring me." I was trying to be as clear as I could, using body language too in case he didn't speak English well. He doesn't listen and keeps approaching, still muttering angrily. At this point, I'm not listening to what he is saying but trying to look for a way to escape. Because he is not backing down, I notice he has a distinctive limp, and I'm in hills and not sure that I can outrun him. I automatically dart back from my building and start pounding on the door, hoping the cleaning crew would hear me, but they don't. As soon as he sees me run, he starts charging at me. At this point I can't see this being a misunderstanding, and I'm sure he has bad intentions. I look around me and notice a blue safety light a little bit past my building in the opposite direction. I drop my bag and sprint for it. I hear his footsteps chasing me. I push the bag button and I'm connected with the campus safety, and I immediately yell my location and that a man is approaching me right now and looks like he is about to hurt me. He is still charging at me and almost to me, but I don't want to be disconnected from the police, so I stay at the safety light and yell at him that I'm talking to the police right now. Campus police say they are on their way. He continues coming at me and I'm shaking at this point and planning my self-defense. I was thinking I would kick him behind the knee of his limping leg and then book it if he tried to attack. At the very last minute he brushes my shoulder, hitting it, and then turns and runs off in front of me past the front of the building and then darts off down the street. I figure hearing me call the cops scared him off. I hate to think what could have happened if I had walked home towards this man out of reach of any safety lights. About 2 minutes later, campus police arrive. I gave them a description of the suspect and they drove me home. They called about 20 minutes after dropping me off, saying they found someone down the road matching this description but wanted to know if I remembered him having a backpack or not. I said I couldn't remember, and so I guess they had to let him go, and I hope nobody ever has to experience what I did that night. Story 11. We had many things happen in our 5 years of living here, but this one night I will never forget, and I've told this story many times, but here we go. We were living in a bad part of town. Well, it was horrible, but you always lock your cars and your doors and your car trunk, pretty much anything with a lock. This night was like any other. We were watching TV and both of us were playing on our PCs in the living room. We are huge gaming nerds and our PCs are always in the living room at this time. Our cat Bleached Spot was sitting in the kitchen window crying, which was odd because she never cried. My husband proceeded to get up and go check things out, and we see a foot. Yes, a foot in our kitchen window. My husband opens the window and asks the guy why he is standing in our kitchen window. This guy was a Hispanic guy who apparently lived in the apartment above ours. Got locked out somehow and was trying to crawl up the outside of the building to get back into his apartment. He told the guy to get down from there before he breaks his neck. The guy tells my husband okay and proceeds to climb down. He also had to climb down because my husband was hanging on to his foot as well. He was not letting that guy climb up the outside wall. Now just think for a second. These were 2-story apartments, and he was almost to the 2nd story, and I'm guessing that he was already 8 feet up in the air. How he thought that he was going to be able to climb up is beyond any rational thoughts I can put together. While the guy was climbing back down, my husband gets on the phone to call 911. It just didn't look right. I mean, clearly it didn't look right for him to be climbing up there. I mean, if he was locked out for a good reason, you would call the landlord or maintenance man to come with you back into the apartment. Our landlord lived on the premises along with the maintenance man as well, so we knew that something fishy was going on here. We called 911, explained that this guy was climbing up the outside of our building trying to get into the top apartment, and they said they would send someone out. This guy goes around to the front of the apartment building, goes upstairs, and proceeds to beat on the door for about 15 minutes straight. My husband even opened the door and hollered upstairs and told him to knock it off, that it was getting very late. It was around 1 a.m. at this time. He is still beating on the door when the cop arrives to find out what is going on or arrest him, whatever they had planned to do there. The cop goes upstairs and tells him to stop beating on the door and to come downstairs so they could talk and settle some things. This guy didn't like the policeman apparently, so somehow in an enclosed breezeway he gets away from the cop and runs away. The next thing I know, I found out why this guy was climbing up our window and upstairs beating the door down. A lady cop came to our door and wanted to come inside to talk to us. She told us this guy was kicked out by his girlfriend. He was illegally in the US, and the reason she wasn't up there, her and her mother both were in the hospital. He had beaten them both black and blue with a baseball bat. His girlfriend wanted to break up with him, and when she did, he got mad and almost beat them to death. Apparently he did all of this before we had gotten home that evening and while we were at my husband's mother's house. So when we got home, the commotion was already over and no one had told us a thing. The female cop told us to make sure that we lock our windows and keep our front doors locked. They were going to have a cop car with a spotlight all night checking over the apartment complex and basically in the area where these apartments were located. She said to consider this guy very dangerous and not try to apprehend him ourselves. We agreed with her. She gave us her card and told us a good night. The next day, the sweet lady who lived across the hall from us came over to let us in on some info. Apparently they did find the guy, but he was never caught because he got away from them again. The mother and daughter, or well, his ex-girlfriend, were stable but still in bad shape, but they would make it. Story 12. This happened about a month ago, and it's still been bugging me since. This will be a long story, so listen at your own risk. Setting up the scene is very important. My family has a cabin that we've had since the 60s, and I've been going there for my entire life throughout the years. It's nestled in a little town of less than 2,000 and surrounded in vast forests and farmland. You'll see cows everywhere and stray dogs who will let you pet them. You'll maybe see 30 people in a day if you go in a little town, and small mom and pop restaurants everywhere. It's the definition of a small country town. Since I've been going here my entire life, I pretty much know everybody. All my family knows everyone. Men dress in Western clothes with big jeans and old flannel shirts and belts with big belt buckles. Women dress in jeans and tank tops with country factory logos on them. They're all nice enough but keep to themselves. I'm driving up here one night to meet my parents since they had gone down the night previously to open the cabin for spring. My boyfriend had also flown in so he could meet my family who lived up there. I had been driving until it got dark, about a 2-hour and 10-minute drive from my house, and he had taken over driving around 10 p.m. There's also a little national park close by, about 15 minutes in total of land, and since I had fallen asleep and couldn't give directions, he decided to log the address into his GPS. It took him through the back way through the park that I never drive through. So when he woke me up to ask where to turn since the GPS said he could go either way, it took me a minute to figure out where we were. There were no lights anywhere, and we were the only car for those 15 miles. Long forests with tall giant trees on either side of the road, with a lonely deer or two in the woods to keep us company. I mentioned switching drivers because I remember that road, the entrance to the park that would lead directly to the intersection that would go through a small community. Up to the mountain my cabin was on, but it was prime. Leave a toy baby on the side of the road and kidnap somebody when they checked it out. Territory. It was dark enough and the forest was thick enough that we joked that some cult members could be hiding out there. I mean, maybe they were. Needless to say, we decided stopping wasn't a good idea. We eventually passed through a small clearing intersection, not the one we wanted, with a dinky concrete building on the side of the road with one light on, and a car that was pulled into the slanted gravel ground. My boyfriend drives forward, and we see two people there. My gut immediately twisted, and I started to feel sick. Sick enough to feel ice cold run through my veins and needing a hand on my stomach. You never see people at night here. It was two kids, two boys in fact. Probably around 15. They were wearing city clothes, shorts with logos on them and obnoxiously colored sports workout clothes, and looked very out of place. They saw us coming and walked away from what looked to be an old beat-up El Camino, probably a 65. It's important to note that the paint was completely gone and it had a light brown dirt or rust that was covering the body. They waved and smiled at us, and that was what freaked me out the most. I didn't have a clue who these people were, and I knew a gas station that was right up the road. They could just walk there. I could see it past the road and overhead bridge. That building was also abandoned, so how was there a light on the wall? They walked out onto the road, almost blocking us from going forward, and my boyfriend had to slow down not to hit them as they continuously waved their arms and smiled at us, maybe saying something but I couldn't hear. I remember mine and my boyfriend's conversation going something like this. He asked, "Should we stop?" looking nervously at me with a hand on the gear shift. "No, absolutely not. Just keep driving," I said, clenching the door handle and double-checking it to be locked. "But babe, they could be in trouble." "I don't care. I don't know them. My gut is telling me that we need to leave. That building's abandoned. It shouldn't have a light, and heck, their car is abandoned. Just drive, please." He quickly drove around them and slammed on the gas, trying to calm me down since the whole scene scared me in such a specific and bizarre way. Images of getting out of the car as some stranger got in flew through my head. I looked behind us, and they stood in the middle of the road with a cross between an angry look and a calm stare, and didn't move from the road until we turned and couldn't see them anymore. Who were those kids? Why were they wearing city clothes? They looked too young to be driving cars, and I knew for a fact that the car that they acted like they owned had been there for months. I knew because I remembered seeing it last summer when my dad pointed out the model and I said how I wanted an El Camino someday. We finally made it out and found the intersection we wanted that led to the familiar gas station, and he didn't hesitate when I said I needed to drive next. About 10 or so minutes later we got to my cabin, half-heartedly laughing about it the whole way there. When I told my parents about it, they didn't reprimand us for not stopping. It was almost 12 a.m. by that time, and the night wasn't so bad that those kids would freeze, and they agreed with us that the whole situation was very weird. Should I have stopped? I don't know. Maybe. Can I change what I did? No. Did I feel comfortable stopping? Absolutely not. I just hope I never see those two boys again. Story 13. This happened to me on Thursday, April 25th, and I still can't shake off how terrifying and strange it was. I was home alone getting ready for my 12 p.m. class that morning, and I opened my blinds to let some natural light in. I glanced out my window to see a man in his mid-30s wearing a baseball cap roaming around my property with his hands on his hips, walking with a lot of weird confidence. Our yard is kind of like a cliff, and it looks over onto our 5 acres of property down below. I live in a pretty scenic area with a really nice view. I was really confused and thought maybe it was a worker that my mom had hired for our renovations of the house that was just admiring the view. I'm a little bit uncomfortable at this point because the guy walks to the side of my house and out of sight. I head upstairs to see him now roaming around my front yard in my driveway, looking at things, checking out my house. He still hasn't seen me at this point. I called my dad and asked him if we had hired anybody recently to come by the house, and he says not that he knows of, and tells me that he's going to call my mom and ask her and then call me back. I'm waiting for the call when I notice this strange guy's car. It's a white Honda with no license plates, just parked parallel to my front door. The guy still hasn't seen me, and he's still wandering around, so I take this as an opportunity to remember that we have a security system, and I'm armed it so if he tried to break in it would immediately alert the police. If this was some sort of professional or worker, he would have rang my doorbell or knocked at least once. He did neither. Just then I get a call back from my dad saying neither him or my mom hired anybody to come by today, and then I need to call the police immediately. I went back downstairs after making sure to lock every door and window upstairs and called my city's police station. I explained to a woman on the other end of the phone what is happening, and she decides that she is not going to send an officer out and instead gives me a number to call their emergency dispatch line and told me to talk to them. I call the number she gave me, and immediately I get an automated message saying thank you for calling the non-emergency hotline. Nobody is available to take a call right now. If this is an emergency, please hang up and dial 911. At this point, I'm really irritated because 15 minutes has passed and this weird guy is still lurking around my house while I'm home alone, and apparently that wasn't enough to warrant an emergency to the lady I called at my local police station. I hung up and decided to call 911 after getting in touch with the 911 operator. I was asked a series of questions about his appearance before they would even alert officers near me to start heading towards my house. The whole thing seemed really weird. Nobody was in a hurry to have police come up to my place when I was a younger girl home alone with a strange guy outside. I asked the officer if I could stay on the line with her when she finally, after what seemed like forever, alerted police to come to where I was. She agreed, and I went back upstairs to check on the weird guy. And he's now sitting in his unplated Honda, either listening to a radio show extremely loudly or on a phone call with someone through his car. There was a very prominent loud male voice coming from his car. Then all of a sudden I hear the tone you hear when somebody hangs up on you, and the operator was no longer on the line. I was really confused when my thoughts were interrupted by an unrecognized phone number calling me. I assumed it was the operator calling me back, so I picked up. Instead, I was greeted by really creepy heavy breathing. I'm not sure whose it was, but it really scared me. I hung up immediately and dialed back 911. I had been pretty calm up to this point, but that phone call put me in panic mode. I got on the phone with another operator who already knew my situation and address before I could even explain it to her. She said the police were on their way. 20 minutes had passed at this point. The guy is still in his car and the police aren't here. Keep in mind, I live in a smaller town, so there is no reason why it took the police as long as it did for them to come down. Finally, this guy is leaving my driveway right as the police pull in, and they stop and ask him a few questions. A cop then comes to my door and hands me a sketchy-looking flyer saying it was just a landscaper. He said he had an appointment. I was really relieved and irritated that it was just a guy my mom had hired until I realized it wasn't. I called my mom back and said the police said it was just a landscaper that you hired, and he had an appointment. My mom replies with, "I can assure you we never hired a landscaper. We don't even need one. So anybody with somebody outside posing to be a landscaper immediately called the police." Story 14. It's worth mentioning that whilst this story takes place in a Southeast Asian city with a population of over 1.5 million, I didn't always live here. I was born and raised in a small town in the Midwestern United States. You know, the kind where everyone knows everyone and we only gain attention during an election year. Anyway, my parents and I made the big move in 2014 due to a number of reasons. The biggest being so that my mother could be with her family, since this was her homeland. However, the town where all my relatives live is about 8 hours away. So we had to move to our city because it was the safest in the region for foreigners, and my dad is a white guy. Now, unlike every other college student in the world, I hadn't done much this summer. The heat was blistering all hours of the day, and I didn't have money to spend even if I was willing to leave our air-conditioned apartment. The only thing enticing me into the outdoors were the incessant sounds of construction due to a new unit being added to our complex. However, leaving was of course inevitable. So towards the end of the month, my parents and I went to buy groceries. The next day, my mom and I went out to buy some things that we had initially forgotten, and the day after that the two of us went out again to pay some bills. That made 3 consecutive days of going out for the first time in about a month. To say I was exhausted was an understatement, and by 7 p.m. on the third night I was already fast asleep on the living room couch. My mother woke me up at around 10 that night and told me to head up to my room. I was too tired to do my entire night's routine, so I quickly brushed my teeth and went upstairs. I noticed that my cat was already asleep in my bed, since he's basically my mother's shadow. So I got into bed whilst contorting myself into an angle that wouldn't disturb him. Cat lovers, you know what I'm talking about. I turned on a dim light, plugged in my headphones, and started playing a random video on YouTube. Then eventually fell asleep. I didn't know what time it was, but I awoke to the feeling of my bed shaking. I tend to ignore movements like this because they happen often when my cat sleeps with me, as he has a habit of scratching his ear. But there was a pretty strong earthquake just the night before, so I assumed it was another one, making me open my eyes and look down at my cat to see which of the two it was. Indeed, it was he scratching his ear, and my mother was also at the foot of my bed. Nothing out of the ordinary. She was probably checking on me before my dad and her went out on their 5 a.m. walk, as routine, and was bending down to pet the cat. I closed my eyes and was just about to slip back into slumber when my half-asleep brain remembered a number of things that were indeed out of the ordinary. With my eyes that were barely open, I looked at who I thought was my mother with blurred vision. The first thing I noticed was that she was wearing one of my high school t-shirts. My mother and I are far from the same size, and she doesn't have a history of borrowing my clothes. Weird but not unsettling. Maybe she ran out of clean exercise shirts and decided to use one of mine. Then I noticed that she was also wearing one of my high school t-shirts, but this one was wrapped around her head in a way that outlined the shape of it, not covering anything but just framing the profile. In my peripheral vision, I noticed that my closet doors were wide open. My mother always nagged me to close them because she said it wasted the cool air coming in from the air conditioner. So I made sure to keep them closed whenever I wasn't getting ready. And another random realization hit me when my brain finally registered the fact that while my mom does pet my cat when she comes in to check on me, she never bent down like the person was in my room, looking. Back now, I don't think I've ever seen her bent down like that since I was a kid. Keep in mind, all these thoughts flooded my mind in about 5 seconds. Still, my half-asleep and half-stupid ass brain was more focused on why my mother was wearing my clothes as opposed to all the things that were off in this situation. That's when the person turned to look right at me before running out of my room, maintaining an ungodly crouching position that will be buried in my mind for the rest of my life. It wasn't until he was near the stairs that I fully processed what was happening. That person was not my mother, and they weren't even a female. Instantly, I shot out of bed and instinctively wrapped my blanket around me to cover my night clothes that suddenly felt so revealing. It was only then that I began screaming. I hesitantly followed him out of my room and watched as he ran down the wooden stairs with deafening steps that echoed throughout the 3rd floor, almost drowning out my piercing cry. If I was going to get my parents' attention, who was sleeping on the other side of the closed door on the 2nd floor, I needed to be louder. I stood at the foot of the stairs and pushed my lungs to their limit. I could practically feel the capacity stretch inside my rib cage, and after what felt like ages, but was probably no more than 5 seconds, my parents' door swung open and my mother ran up the stairs with a panic-stricken expression that I will never forget. She grabbed me by the shoulders and shouted, "What's wrong?" I turned to look at her with my mouth agape and my brows furrowed in a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Had she not seen the man when he ran right past their bedroom? It all happened so fast. I wasn't sure if they had crossed paths or not. I told them that someone was in the house, and I responded in a voice that honestly I didn't even recognize, without missing a beat. She wrapped her arm around me and ushered me down the stairs. "Grab the gun," she shouted in the country's native language, and we ran into my parents' bedroom, where my father stood in the doorway with tired eyes and slumped posture. I pushed him in the room and turned around to close the door, simultaneously fiddling with the light switch so we weren't in complete darkness. My movements were shaky and spastic, causing my fingers to fumble and flicker the lights on and off before eventually being able to lock the door. "What are you doing?" my dad asked with a soft laugh, as he switched on the lights after my attempts proved to be futile. I turned to him with the same incredulous expression I had when I was looking at my mom. He had been standing in the doorway to his running perfect view of the running man, yet he seemed to be oblivious. "There's someone in the house," I repeated, watching his face instantly drop at my words. With the door now locked, I turned to my parents and watched them silently, waiting for them to say or do something. For 19 years they had taken care of me and catered to my every want and need. Now they stood, just as scared and defenseless as I was, and in that moment, they were just people. My dad, an infamous type of personality, kept his focus on the floor, most likely processing the entire situation before deciding what to do next. My mother was the complete opposite. Her cell phone was in one hand, whilst the other, She was trying to run through her hair so many times that I'm sure the strands were going to end up between their fingers. I can't call 911. It's not working, she said. I took the phone from her and dialed it myself, bringing the phone up to my ear, only to hear a monotone voice say, "Sorry, your balance is too low to make this call. In this country, most of the phones are prepaid. So if you don't have money in your account, you can't make any calls or texts." However, my mum said that she had added to her account a few hours earlier. I tried calling my aunt who lives about 8 hours away and it worked. And it was then that I figured that you can only use cell phones to call other cell phones and you can't use them to call landlines. ACA 911. The only problem was that our landline was on the second floor hallway, a few feet away from the other side of the door. I told my parents what our options were and my mother opened the window and began shouting for help in her native tongue, similar to a knee-jerk reaction. I instantly shut the window. Don't do that. They know we're defenseless and come back. At the time this happened, we had been in the room for about 40 minutes and I was convinced that if they had left and then heard screaming, they would come back because they would know we were sitting ducks. "Are you sure you saw someone? Maybe you were just dreaming," my dad said, this being his first string of words, and barricading ourselves inside. How could he have gotten in? The door has 2 locks and a heavy pole across it. A little context about the pole. After the lock on our screen door broke, my mother had insisted on putting a metal pole across the door to ensure that no one would be able to get in. "No, I know what I saw," I answered without hesitation, but my brain started dissecting the possibilities of the figure. Simply being a fragment of my imagination, the sounds of movement he made were so vivid, but the situation as a whole seemed too surreal. There was no way someone could get inside with that pole acting as a shield, and neither of my parents had seen the man. Internally, even I was 100% sure of myself. But on the outside, I stuck to my guns. "I saw a man." "Okay. Then we need to get out of this room and call the police," my dad said. My overreacting got the best of me, and I thought about us leaving the room. Were there more people? Were they waiting for us? Were they right outside the door? Or were they hiding and would spring out when we least expected it? Maybe they were still in our apartment, continuing to raid through our things, since they know that we were too scared to leave. Had they heard my mother screaming for help and came back? We searched the room for weapons to protect ourselves with, but we wouldn't find anything even remotely useful. You may be wondering what happened to the gun my mother was shouting about earlier. It never existed. She just said that so that I would hopefully leave out of fear. So with half a pair of broken scissors in my dad's hand and a small floor fan in my mother's, we prepared ourselves for whatever was on the other side of that door. My dad unlocked the door and swung it open swiftly, hoping to catch anyone out there off guard. The complete silence mixed with the eerie yellow lighting coming from our hallway seemed like a scene from a horror movie. Straight ahead we all noticed that the door to the second floor balcony was wide open and the screen on the window next to it had been pried open as well. The first feeling to run through me was assurance. Assurance of knowing that I wasn't crazy and hadn't just made it up. The second feeling to run through me was pure dread, knowing that I wasn't crazy and I unfortunately hadn't made it up. We searched the second floor and found no one and nothing. We then moved on to the first floor and we found our pitcher of water dripping with condensation on the kitchen table. My mother asked me if I had forgotten to put it back before I went to bed, but I distinctly remember only brushing my teeth. I knew I hadn't gotten it out. Our windows have the glass on the outside and the screen on the inside, contradictory to typical American windows, and we saw that the glass windows were wide open and that the screen had been pried with. However, both of the locks on the door were bolted and the pole was still in place. We figured that the man had initially attempted to come through by putting his hand through the small gap he made in the window screen, trying to reach for the door so that he could unlock it. However, I suppose his calculations were off and he couldn't make the distance. That's when he climbed up to the second floor, probably by scaling the apartment that the construction workers had yet to finish, and did the same procedure to the balcony window. He was successful this time because the distance was much shorter. We called 911 a total of 5 times, and it took them 45 minutes to get to our apartment despite the fact that we live a 3-minute drive away. While waiting, my mother knocked on other apartments to let them know what was going on. Now our complex consists of 4 different apartments. The first one is rented out to an online business company. The second is rented out to a family who had just moved in that exact night. We're in the third. The fourth had no tenants. Neither of them answered, and it was probably because it was 2:30 a.m. The police came eventually and told us that someone had made a call earlier saying that they heard a woman screaming for help, but that they couldn't find the exact location of the screams. They searched the house but found no one and didn't even tell us how to file a report. Yeah, they were pretty useless. The next day my mom spoke to the people at the first apartment, and they were obviously shaken up. They told her that they had heard her knocking, but that it's company policy not to open the door from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. My mother moved on to apartment 2 and told them what happened, and the man and his pregnant wife said that they didn't hear anything despite going to bed at 2 a.m. and having all their windows open. I was somewhat skeptical because my scream was pretty loud, even giving my mother nightmares days after the incident, and all our windows and second story door were open. There's another building just a few feet away, so sound resonates pretty loudly, making the construction booming even behind closed doors, and my mother screams that were enough to make someone call the police. I highly doubt they didn't hear anything with the first apartment. It made sense though, and all the windows were closed due to the air conditioning being left on. My mother told the couple to be wary of the construction workers because she believed that they decided to rob us after seeing that my father was a foreigner, automatically assuming that we must be rich or something. The man's face instantly dropped, and his tone turned cold. My mother asked him for the landlord's number since the old number no longer worked, and he said that he would give it to her after he went to see her today since he didn't have it on him. It took him 4 days to finally give it to us, and he did so with what seemed like a sincere apology, saying sorry for taking so long and for what happened to us. That same day we called the landlord, and she seemed shocked, telling us that nothing like that had ever happened in any of her apartments before. However, my mother had spoken with tenants in the apartment complex behind our own, which happened to be owned by the same landlord, and she says that she knows of at least 3 people in her complex who have had their place broken into. Later the maintenance man came to inspect our windows, and we found out that the construction workers were hired because they are all members of our landlord's church, and the man who just moved in with his wife is the bishop of their church. Before my mother could even bring up her theory, the maintenance man told her that he was convinced it was the construction workers. We kept realizing that things were missing over the course of 2 weeks, like my backpack, some sunglasses, money, jewelry, some stuff out of our storage room, as well as other things. My phone was also taken. I assume that's why he was crouching over my bed. He was trying to reach for both the phone and the charger, since I was probably laying on the wire or something. My laptop and camera were both sitting on my desk next to my jewelry box, but he didn't take those. My parents assume it's because he was going to take the heavier items when he was about to leave, so he wouldn't have to carry them around. However, I didn't see anything in his hand when he was running away from me, which makes me think that he either left the other items by the door for an easy exit, or there was someone else in the house helping him out. A few weird things. He took 4 of my shirts, two of them being exactly the same. He also went to my cousin's room and stole her towel. Thankfully she had gone home for the summer, so she wasn't around, but it almost seemed as if the thief knew that. He went into her room and my room, but completely avoided my parents' room. I also couldn't get over the fact that he drank our water straight from the jug, which would have made sense since he climbed to the second story. However, this country is notorious for being superstitious, and my mum said that thieves tend to leave water out because it makes the homeowners go to deep sleep. Something about water resembling the calming waves of an ocean. I've never been one to believe in superstition, and she thinks that's why I was able to wake up. Just a few hours after the incident, we decided that we were going to move back to the States. This wasn't the only occurrence affecting our decision, but it was the straw that broke the camel's back. I'm just thankful that we all came out safe and nothing worse happened. I'm also incredibly grateful for my cat, since he's basically the hero for waking me up. Story 15. In freshman year of middle school, there was a once-a-week group therapy session with developmentally delayed kids that involved them doing some craft activity, or playing with Legos, or watching a movie as a group. It was half normal kids, half DD kids, and the normal kids could sign up for it. I signed up pretty much instantly, as it meant an escape from history once a week. One of my best friends at the time had the same idea, and it basically turned into a second lunch period for us. The whole thing was overseen by a therapist named Bruce, and it was generally pretty laid back. Bruce was an overweight 50-ish balding guy with an attitude and general appearance of Santa Claus. He ran most of the school's extracurricular activities and was pretty much universally liked. The other important player in the school was a kid I'll call G. You know, the stereotype of psychopaths being obsessed with animal torture as kids. Well, this was dead on G. He would regularly tell these long, excited stories during group time about how much fun he had last week tearing the leg off a squirrel that he caught in his live trap, or other similar things. Most of us has sort of ignored him, and it was just assumed that he would talk and make up gross stuff to get attention. So one week we were playing with Play-Doh. Since it was a DD group, the huge tub of Play-Doh had long since assumed a uniform shade of turd brown, and the general drive was to get people to build things and tell stories about them. Most people just put dinosaurs or threw clay at each other. G, for whatever reason, had a huge flat square slab laid out and was building 4 large pillars on the corner. He eventually put a roof on it, which wouldn't stay on due to the lack of interior supports. The normal kids would always leave a few minutes earlier, as the group time ran into the start of next period, and we would need to get to class. I was no different, and walked out whilst Bruce and the other kids were smashing Play-Doh, giggling, and throwing chunks of turd dough back into the bin. I got to my next class, and the teacher wasn't there. Nobody knew what was going on, and about 10 minutes later she showed up looking frazzled, and would not give us any other information other than something happened. Being 6th graders, we went nuts with speculation. A few hours later I ran into a friend from the group who was visibly jumpy and disturbed. He wouldn't tell me why, other than mentioning that group therapy would be cancelled indefinitely. I kept prying for information and eventually got the story out of him. So during the cleanup, the Play-Doh had been compacted back into the tub, and this involved lots of smashing Play-Doh sculptures. A bit that the DD kids greatly enjoyed at this point when they tried to smash other people's stuff. G's house was one of the last things to go. He smashed down 2 columns and let one of the other DD kids smash one of the others, and finally dared Bruce to smash the last one really hard. The last one had a pocket knife in it. We never saw either Bruce or G ever again. Story 16. So my house is on the biggest chunk of property in the tri-state area, and is about 108 acres, and was originally kind of a park but wasn't supposed to be used as a park. Unfortunately, people from all over didn't get the memo that we had moved in and therefore continued to party, hunt and fish wherever they felt like. Over the years, the problems began to go away except for a couple. Before we talk about the perpetrators, or at least the leader, we should discuss what was behind the property. An asylum, mostly housing psychopaths, schizophrenics, and those who had suffered mental breakdowns. It isn't rare to hear random screaming for no reason coming from over there. Anyway, there were 4 men who kept coming back and hunting in the middle of the night. We let some people hunt in there on Saturday nights, but for the most part hunting was off limit. We were never able to catch these 4 middle-aged men who always wore masks. I mentioned that because the leader always wore a creative mask. An especially frightening one. Most of the time he donned a pig mask. These men were sneaky. They were smart, and that's what made them so terrifying. I had 3 encounters with them, the first being in June of last year. A few friends and I had decided to go on an adventure through the woods, and we discovered something frightening. We found a fortress covered in beer cans with a chair at the top. Being teenagers, we decided to do the smart thing, which was to destroy all of the hunters' hard work by kicking the entire fortress down. Boy, had we messed up. We later returned to that fortress to check up on it, and that's when it got scary. It was rebuilt almost as a shrine to the last one, and spray painted on the ground was. Try that again, we dare you. The second encounter happened during a simple walk at night. Sometimes when I got upset, I liked to take walks through the woods. This time was at night, and it just so happened that our favorite hunters were out hunting. I was walking along minding my own business when I see the man in the pig mask, and he sees me. He now knows my face, and I hear a deep laugh as he turns his gun towards me. I have no idea what he's planning, but I booked it out of there ASAP so that I didn't have to figure out what. This is my 3rd encounter, and it was the most blood-curdling and occurred only a few weeks ago, and I was walking home from my cousin's house in the dark. I had my flashlight shining, and I felt safe, but something was off. The barn lights were on. The barn lights are never on. No one ever goes in the barn. The floors are falling through. So I simply brushed it off as a technical error, but then in the middle of the field I saw the man with the pig mask, and he saw me, and his words have haunted my dreams since he yelled them at me. "You, get the hell out of here before I make you." The way he said it, the intonation of every word, it was angry, so vicious, dead set on revenge. I haven't been in the woods since then. It was later discovered, the barn, they had been setting up shop there for some time. They haven't been found yet, and I doubt they ever will. Story 17. I was camping on land associated with the Anasazi, long-dead Pueblo Indians that very few people know anything about. This was when I was a Boy Scout. We hiked for a few days, and we saw black bears every day. It's normally a somewhat unusual sight, and freaked out the adult leaders, and caused us to religiously use anti-bear tactics like bear bags. Not totally related to the story, but it slowed us down, which led us to the events here. Anyway, we camped in a wood cabin at the bottom of a plateau, and the local rangers told us a bunch of spooky camp stories about the plateau and its relation to the long-dead Anasazi people. Even their real names is lost to history, as Anasazi is what the Navajo called them, meaning ancient enemies, or those who are not us. Another part of what they told us that stands out is that the Anasazi were obsessed with ravens, and possibly crows as well, and a lot of their superstition revolved around massive raven people and people with raven heads, stuff like that. I completely forget all the other details at this point, as it was well over a decade ago. Anyway, my tent mate is a bit slow and is also very allergic to peanuts. He ends up eating some of the pre-packaged food that contains a copious amount. That, combined with the ongoing poor planning, fear of bears, and sloppy leadership, causes the adults to decide to camp out on the plateau rather than keep going. On this scout ranch you're only supposed to camp outside the designated areas and never on the particular plateau just because of the geography and the environment, but forget the rules because we do anyway. We set up camp, eat, lay the bear bag and head off to sleep. That night though was the craziest thing. I could hear so much thunder and so could my tent mate, but absolutely no rain, like insanely loud. My tent mate and I were terrified. It could have been heat lining, but it sounded impossibly close. We're terrified. He, the braver one of the two, actually goes out to check. As he opens the flap, I see the forest behind him. He comes back a few minutes later, and the thunder pretty much stops at the same time. He looks at me and goes to bed without saying anything at all. It's not unusual in itself. He could be pretty slow and non-social and likely had mild autism in hindsight, but the next day we wake up and a ton of things pop red flags. Firstly, our tent is facing an open field, which is very strange because yesterday we both saw Forrest from when he left the tent to check. Second, no one else heard lightning that night except for us, which was absolutely crazy as it was loud enough to wake everyone on Earth. Remember how my tent mate checked out the thunder as well? Well, he had no recollection of what he saw. He woke up confused, saying that the last thing that he remembered was just stepping outside. The good part though, the guy in the tent next door brought this up before we did. He also decided to get up and check it out, and he claims that when he stepped out of the tent there were no trees anywhere. Just extremely long, tall pole objects, almost as if there were thousands of stilts. When he looked up, he also said that there was no lightning visible, but it was super bright. Full moon on steroids bright. He also claimed that he had seen flying winged pitch black objects bigger than cars, and they looked like they had wings on them and that they were round. He dug back inside and doesn't remember going to sleep or the noise going away. Remember the giant raven myths? I did. I wouldn't have believed him if I hadn't have seen the trees and heard the thunder for myself. Thank you for listening, and I wish you good health. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us. Thank you very much.